Hello, everyone, and yeah, I'm in Seattle now. Welcome to our final lecture. We're actually going to combine lessons 14 and 15 because they're both about policy. Lesson 14, which is what we're going to start off with, talks mostly about general American and domestic policy, while lesson 15, chapter 16, focuses on foreign policy. I figure it's really easy to get both of these out of the way all at once, and you're going to notice there was only one video for the two of these anyways. So when we talk about policy, public policy is everywhere in our lives because it's everywhere that government is in our lives, and we know that's everywhere. Public policy is really simply defined. It's everything the government chooses to do or chooses not to do. I know that sounds kind of weird, but it's anything that the government intends. The first step when we're talking about policy making is when we need to identify and define a problem. We can't fix something, we can't make policy, anything like that until we know what we're talking about. After we identify a problem, it's necessary to determine how important it is and how urgent it is to take care of. And then the next step is to review possible solutions and select the ones most likely to be successful. And remember, there's multiple factors that go into problem solving when we're talking about policy. It's money, it's time, it's long-term sustainability. The example I like to use when we're talking about policy making, say it's a small isolated policy. Say we're making policy in Wichita. They have to first identify and define the problem. So the one that I really like using, if any of you have ever driven on Harry Street, especially between, like, say, Oliver and Hillside, it's really, really rough sometimes. And so maybe they've identified and defined the issue as, hey, we need to fix Harry Street in this location. After we've identified that there's a problem that we need to fix, we need to determine how important and urgent it is to do so. So when we look at that section of Harry Street, we're like, wait, it is kind of important because there's schools, there's businesses, and really importantly, there's one of the major hospitals for Wichita. And so it's probably really important that we keep that road operational and keep it really well maintained. Then we look at possible solutions and the ones most likely to be successful. So this is that third step in policy making and evaluation. So once we identify we need to fix Harry Street, and then we're like, okay, it's really important that we do so pretty quickly because it needs to be maintained. Third step, we say, all right, well, how are we actually going to do this? We've already acknowledged that this is a really important street, so we can't just shut it all down and fix it. We also have to consider money constraints. You know, we can't just fix it in 1 week. You always notice that construction projects don't just take 1 week. We need to find the company that is going to bid and give the best deal to the government so that we don't have to use more taxpayer dollars than we need to. But then again, we might be willing to pay a little bit more to get a quicker job done. And then, since we can't shut it all down, how do we handle this? Are we going to shut down one lane at a time? One direction at a time? Are we going to do the entire length all at once in one lane? Or are we going to do parts of it and do 3 lanes? We have to figure that all out. It's a lot more complicated than you think when you first look at that issue. And that's why we have so many people in government and so many people figuring out what to do. Elected leaders typically will figure out which policy options that we're going to adapt and how we're going to actually implement them. They're the ones who actually take bids and figure out these semantics. They have a tough job figuring out what's going to work the best for us, and sometimes they don't always make the right decision. But the big thing is, if we have a good leader, they're willing to adapt. Government bureaucracies, remember what we talked about a couple weeks ago? Those are who usually carry out the task of executing that policy. The courts can also play a role in policy making as well, especially if it's a policy about a topic that's really sensitive. Maybe there's a city ordinance or a policy going through about marijuana usage. The court's going to have to be involved, especially because there's a legal question. The government also has a job to assess the impact of the policies and determine their continued utility. So this is where we kind of have checks and balances. If we have policy that goes through and it turns out we didn't make the right decision and put it through correctly, it's the government's job to figure out to reduce the damage and change that policy as necessary. They can also decide, yeah, maybe we had a Water Improvement Act that we started 5 years ago. It's not really having the intended results and it's costing way more money than we budgeted for. Maybe we need to stop that act, change it, and put something new through to help people out. Policies also have a lot of unintended consequences that aren't always apparent when they're adapted. So maybe in order to get Harry Street fixed the quickest and the cheapest, we chose a company that turns out doesn't use the best materials for roads. And so a government policymaker goes down and checks on the progress, and they just started the project, and they don't like what's going on, or maybe they don't like the environmental impact of changing the road there. They're going to halt the process and fix it as necessary. But sometimes it can be a really slow process to change policy because we have a lot of bureaucratic pathways that we have to go through. Whether the government decides to adopt a policy really depends on costs and benefits, because we're in a capitalistic society. Everything our government does either costs time, money, expertise, any number of things. Policies that allocate costs and distribute benefits widely are the easiest to sustain. What this means is if everybody has to pay into it a penny, say everybody in this classroom has to pay $1 into a fund, but then everybody gets a benefit from that fund, like maybe everybody gets lunch today because they put $1 into a fund. That policy is really well sustainable as long as it balances out and the lunch is only worth about $1. Policies with widely distributed costs but concentrated benefits also tend to raise little opposition, but sometimes you get some opposition. What this means is if I made everyone in the classroom pay $1, but only 80% of you got lunch out of the deal, a couple of you would kind of be upset, but most people would be happy, so it wouldn't necessarily change policy. When costs and benefits are both concentrated, especially in different spots, interests can clash and the government has to mediate disputes. We see this is also very similar to if costs are very concentrated but benefits are widely distributed and may not actually benefit the person paying into it. So if I made one of you pay $10 and 90% of you got lunch out of it, the person who paid $10 may or may not get lunch, most people will be happy, but there's going to be a lot of clashing. If I made one of you pay $10 and one of you got lunch, but nobody else did, and the one who got lunch isn't the one who paid $10, a lot of people would also be really upset. So this causes issues in the policy making process. In the government side of things, we might see this, say, with environmental regulations. If we require a specific company to stop dumping a lake or change their industrial processes for the better of the environment, if we make them pay certain fines, it causes a very concentrated cost. But in general, it's widely distributed benefits because it benefits everybody and the environment. When I specifically talk about domestic policy, this refers to government action that affects citizens just within the United States. You can kind of guess what foreign policy definition is going to be. The government began taking steps to protect the environment in the 20th century, and that's when we see the development of things like the EPA. Theodore Roosevelt established the National Park Service. That was about a century ago in the early 1900s. We have environmental protection really booming in the 1970s. What's really cool is we've seen a lot of advantages come from the development of the EPA and other legislation. Pollution has declined a lot since the adoption of these regulations. If we see other countries that are higher in pollution, say like China, they're just now recently establishing the equal bureaucracy to the EPA that we have. Environmental agencies tend to generate a lot of controversy, like I said, because sometimes their costs can be ultra concentrated. Usually they focus on industry, but the benefits are given to everybody. So even the people in the industry have advantages. Initially, the government tried to compel compliance to the industrial complex through threats and fines. What they settled on instead is a system of regulatory negotiation. This is essentially kind of a merit or a credit system. They worked with the government, the industry did, to have consensus on acceptable actions and how they're going to take care of the environment. This led to something called a cap and trade market-based system, in which companies can trade credits with one another. Here's another example. I remember seeing a major advertisement campaign a while back about, I think it was Sunships was the company. They run a very green company. They use a lot of recyclables, they use a lot of renewable energy sources and stuff like that. And so according to the EPA, they're doing pretty well. So pretend all industries are given 10 credits each year that they get to use for pollution by the EPA. You are not allowed to use more than 10 credits or you have major fines or you get shut down. So say we have a company like Sunships. They don't use all 10 credits each year because they're really sustainable. They did that on their own. So maybe they only use 1, 2 credits each year. But then we have other industries like ExxonMobil, and they haven't gone very green, anything like that. And they're like, oh crap, we're going to use more than our 10 credits this year. We're actually going to use 15. We can't use 15 or we're going to get shut down. But with a cap and trade system, something that they can do is they can purchase environmental credits from Sunships. Sunships makes a bunch of money off of their 5 environmental credits. Nobody gets shut down. That's kind of how that system works. So then what happens is Mobil Exxon has their 15 credits. They don't get shut down. Sunships is left with 3 remaining credits because they used 2, sold 5. All the math. And then they have 3 remaining. So maybe they sell that off to another company. Who knows? That is how the cap and trade system works with the EPA right now. There might be changes we don't know coming up. There's been recent legislation about clean air going through in the last few years only that says, you know, in the next decade or 2, we want to clean up our fuel usage and our air pollution. I think it was by 20%. And so, you know, there's companies and cities that are proactively making changes just to help with that because they kind of get kudos from the state that they're working in. One of the big reasons that we developed the EPA and why we see a lot of other companies jumping on board with kind of the green revolution is that fossil fuels are reported to be one of the major causes of global warming or climate change, which is a more PC term nowadays. The United States is the second largest source of carbon emissions after China. Now just think about that for a while, guys. Think about the massive population density and difference between us here and China. But we're still the second largest country when it comes to fuel emissions. That's something that we kind of got to worry on. We've gone to war over fuel in the past. In 2012, we failed to sign something called the Kyoto Protocol. We've kind of seen this in the past with a lot of things. We don't like signing agreements like this. We'd rather kind of forge our own path and do it on our own instead of having someone tell us what to do. The Kyoto Protocol, it committed signees to lower carbon emissions to the levels of 1990 by the end of 2012. So it was a pretty hefty goal. Instead, we've decided to put through our own legislation and try and take care of it ourselves. So moving on from environmental policy, the modern social safety net shows a dramatic change in government policy over time. If we think back to previous lectures, what we know as our social safety net these days was pretty much established by FDR with New Deal legislation. Prior to 1900, there were very few laws that protected workers, private organizations, or even provided relief to the poor or unemployed. The Great Depression forced the federal government to take a larger role in helping with that suffering. The Social Security Act in 1935 established what we know as Social Security now. It established unemployment and other what we consider social aid these days that we still use today. The government added healthcare coverage like Medicare and Medicaid in the 1960s. These have reduced a lot of poverty, especially among our older citizens. That was the first and major focus, especially after we took care of the Great Depression, was handling even veterans and other elderly who had gotten out of the workforce and didn't have retirement saved up from the Great Depression. The cost, though, of our social safety programs is large and it's growing. It's something that's not overly sustainable right now, so I would really, in the next presidential election, look towards that as one of the major issues that might be covered, because it's something we have to take care of really, really soon. Entitlements, which are things like Social Security and unemployment, they account for about 50% of our federal budget. That's a major percentage. That's stuff that's usually one of the first things that come up on the chopping block too, but most people keep the programs established because they pretty quickly realize that they're going to need them eventually. All of us are. Reform efforts have typically targeted public assistance programs that we consider welfare. The states have a lot of issues right now because they have a large load when it comes to the costs of taking care of these government programs. A lot of the times, a state is required by the federal government to have a federal program like WIC or food stamps or Medicare and Medicaid. But even though they're required federally to have these programs, they may not receive a lot of federal funding to carry out these programs. So they have a lot of issues. States have a little bit of autonomy. They might be required to have a WIC program, but they're not told how they have to carry it out. They're just told they have to have it at some minimum level. And so that's why we see a lot of variety. You might qualify for food stamp benefits in, I don't know, Texas, but not qualify in Kansas or vice versa. And that's just, you may have the same exact background, the same exact application to the two. But since the states are kind of autonomous, since it's really mostly their money going into the program, that's why we see kind of a lack of equality in the programs. And I can see that definitely coming up if we make some changes in entitlements and our social benefits. The poor tend to lack a lot of political input and political clout, so they don't have the ability to really advocate for themselves to advance the programs that they want supported. Again, when you're too busy just trying to keep a roof over your head and just trying to keep food on the table, you can't always think about political issues or the election going on, anything like that. A lot of the times we see recently religious groups partnering with the government to help administer some of these problems. Like a lot of food banks are now independently owned or operated or assisted by religious organizations. If you think about it, one of the main soup kitchens in Wichita, the Lord's Diner, is a religious institution rather than a governmental institution. So they're trying to pick up the slack a little bit. Moving on to other domestic policy, healthcare is a major one, with the Affordable Care Act being one of the biggest issues of the Obama presidency. It's a major threat to the financial security of Americans. We're actually the only country out of 195 countries in the world that has a concept of medical bankruptcy. You can go bankrupt, you can file bankrupt, you can be financially ruined by getting cancer or breaking a bone and having to have surgery. And that's a completely foreign concept in other countries. That's something that we are trying to fix by moving towards the most common standard of medical care and having more socialized medicine like Germany, Canada, New Zealand, any of these places. In most other industrialized nations, government provides universal coverage for increased taxes. You have to pay a higher tax, but you don't really have to pay for medical insurance. Most countries do have optional medical insurance for, more advanced issues, but most people are fine under the universal plan. They just have to pay a little bit more out of pocket when tax time comes around, rather than paying a premium every month. President Obama's Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, so Obamacare, passed in 2010, and it requires everyone to have health care insurance, either through their employers or through private purchase, which we have the government program now. The government will provide financial assistance to those who can't afford premiums, and as we all know, because we've already gone through a tax season, they will provide penalties to those who choose not to have health care, in a way to encourage people to sign up and participate. The federal government became much more active in the economy and in our general lives during the Great Depression because we needed that help. Fiscal policy, when I talk about this is the use of government's tax and spending authority to influence the national economy. So whenever you see the word fiscal policy, this is when we're talking about economy and budget. When I talk about monetary policy, that's when I'm talking about policy about actual money, actual coinage, actual how we deal with the printing of money. That's, you guys can read through the rest of the slide. You actually don't need any more details on that one. When we talk about money in the federal government, we tend to run a deficit. This is a word you're familiar with, to pay all of our programs. Government finances the deficit by things like treasury bonds. It has to pay interest back on those, but that's how the money gets to the government, not just taxes. Economists in general worry that large government deficits can slow our economic growth, and that's what we're running into right now. We are post-recession. It's really good that we got out of our recession, but now we're seeing a lot of deficits, and that's slowing us from reaching our complete potential when it comes to our economic growth in the U.S. That's something that we really need to take care of. But as we saw earlier, economics is always a major issue when we're talking about an election of any political office. The government has the ability to regulate economic activity by regulating the availability of money. So this is that monetary policy. Federal agencies called the Federal Reserve control our actual supply of money. All nationally chartered banks must belong to the Federal Reserve System. You always see little Federal Reserve symbols on pretty much any banking document. All member banks can borrow money at low rates from 12 regional Federal Reserve banks throughout the U.S., so 12 regional, kind of like our district courts. Regional Federal Reserve banks work with the Board of Governors to establish and implement our monetary policy in the U.S. The Federal Reserve itself uses several tools to affect changes in monetary policy. Their requirement ratio is an amount of money that any federal agency or federal bank requires banks to keep on hand to meet any liability issues. A discount rate is a short-term interest rate that the federal bank charges to its members. Open market operations refer to the federal bank's role in buying and selling government securities. Federal Open Market Committee meets 8 times a year to discuss things and adjust rates at which member banks can loan each other money. This is stuff I'm not going to necessarily test you guys over, but I want you to be familiar with the economy and our monetary policy. It's really important, especially when you look at the government receipt and figure out where your money is actually going. If you really get good at economics, you can look at each dollar that comes out of your paycheck and figure out where it's actually going. When we talk about other economic terms, protectionism is the use of taxes or tariffs to protect domestic production by limiting imports. That's something that we're going to see a little bit more draw to. We've already seen an improvement or an increase in dependence on domestic imports rather than depending on things coming from other companies or other countries. That's going to make us stronger economically as a country. Free trade policies and treaties such as NAFTA. These remove barriers on international trade and create favorable trade countries. The World Trade Organization, the WTO, you might see that throughout your book or whenever you're reading articles that have to deal with the economy. It's the principal world body responsible for negotiating and enforcing international trade. Sometimes you'll hear about the World Bank as well. The World Bank is involved in all economies of a bunch of different countries. Moving on, when we talk about civic engagement and our public policy today, there's a lot of ways that we can influence policy and get our voices heard. It's the same as we talked about throughout the whole semester. Get groups of people together, write letters, get involved in councils, give input on policy. It's really an open process when it comes to policy making. You guys can all get involved in this as long as you know where to look. We can run for elective office, work in government agencies. Even just voting helps influence our public policy. When we talk about federal gridlock, it has state and local governments creating a lot of environmental and healthcare policies. So we have, again, a lot of autonomy that we may not have had, say, 50 years ago in creating these policies. So it gives us more opportunity as an individual citizen to get involved. We just need to get involved in the political process to influence the policy of our economy, our healthcare, everything else. What I want you guys to do is pause the video for a minute and kind of have a discussion. I want you to think about the environment a little bit and tell me, should the government enact a carbon tax to protect the environment? Again, I want you to play devil's advocate and look at this on both sides. Look at who produces the most carbon emissions and what kind of tax we should tax. Should we change our cap and trade system? What kind of taxes do you think would defer excess production of carbon? What do you think would work to our advantage in changing environmental policy? I want you guys to spend 5-10 minutes as a class discussing your opinions on things like this, including EPA changes that you'd like to see made. So moving on to lesson 15, chapter 16, a little bit about foreign policy. We're going to look at some of major goals of foreign policy, some of the principal actors in foreign policy making, tools of foreign policy as well. So there are kind of two divisions when we talk about foreign policy: general foreign policy and then defensive foreign policy. So defense foreign policy is when we have strategic decisions about the use of military force in national security, which has been definitely ramped up in recent years. Foreign policy in general encompasses everything military, diplomatic, economic, and security that involves any other country, any other nation, or any other group at all in general. So when we talk about defense and foreign policy historically, national defense and foreign policy has changed a lot depending on the current, say, trending interests in America and the nature of whatever enemy we seem to have at the time. When I talk about doctrines, you're going to see the Monroe Doctrine, the Bush Doctrine. There's usually a presidential name associated with it. These are kind of the equivalent of executive orders. These are doctrines we're going to see that were written for very specific conflicts and times. So the Monroe Doctrine, this was a warning to European powers that attempts to extend their systems into the Western Hemisphere would be considered a threat to our U.S. peace and safety. In the late 19th century, we sought to achieve a lot of economic expansion, and this would have limited it. So we had the Monroe Doctrine developed, and it kept people from kind of stepping on our toes as we had a major boom. The open door policy declared support for equal access to foreign traders in China. We didn't want China to have any favorites. We wanted them to treat everyone equally so that we would get a good piece of the pie. When I talk about the Roosevelt corollary is like a doctrine, asserted the right of the U.S. to intervene in our neighbors' domestic affairs if they were unable to maintain order and national sovereignty on their own. This is kind of cocky of America. This one essentially says that, hey, Canada, If you have a coup or if we decide that you're not doing very well running your country, you're a neighbor of ours. We don't want someone else to take you over and then have a direct line into us. We're just going to take care of that whole government thing for you, just for a little while till you get on your feet. And then the Truman Doctrine, it guided U.S. policy in the containment of declaring intentions of the U.S. to support free people who resist subjugation and armed minorities or outside pressures. This Truman document is still used today. The doctrine is still used today. It's really important. It says that whenever there's, say, guerrilla warfare, we are the ones who are going to take the underdogs, the ones who are doing the right thing, and we will fully support them as much as we can in doing that right thing. So when they talk about mutually assured destruction, it's something that we have in your study guide, so you should be familiar with this. This is a Cold War principle that essentially said that a bunch of people have weapons. We already know if one person shoots off with a weapon, everybody else is going to shoot off the weapon, so everybody dies. That's why we had a Cold War. Nobody could actually make a move without everybody dying. A period of, I don't know, kind of rockiness in our relations with the former Soviet Union. It ended with Reagan's administration building up arms like crazy. This was eventually a factor in the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. After 9/11, terrorism and the war on terrorism, which we've already kind of talked about how you can't really have a war on a tactic. It's just kind of weird. But the war on terrorism took center stage in American national security policy. It resulted in reorganization of the bureaucracy, changes in intelligence gathering and military policy. We developed the Department of Homeland Security, so again, we expanded our bureaucracy. And we also bore the Bush Doctrine. This said that we could have the use of preemptive force to prevent hostile acts, even if the U.S. is uncertain about their time and place. This essentially justified Bush's ability to go into a country if he suspected weapons and blow the crap out of them. So this is another kind of cocky doctrine that came through and caused a few issues. Now, in the current presidency, Obama has placed a lot more emphasis on cooperation to deal with regional and global issues rather than pulling our guns first. The need to promote universal human rights in all locations, the end to the American combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, a strong focus on developing and strengthening the Asian Pacific relationships in that region. And he does continue to use drone strikes against terrorist threats to make sure that we maintain our security. The most important national security goal is maintaining our security in the face of threats, and we'll do that at just about any cost. A nation's national interests are comprised of military, economic, and ideological concerns about security, and that's something that we have to keep in mind as we develop our foreign policy. Foreign policy itself, when we're defending the U.S., is guided by the notion that each nation, so every single country, is limited in the pursuit of its interests only by the strength of its resources and the power of other nations that they hold over them. Foreign policy realism is something you're going to encounter in your chapter. This is the belief that national interests and policy can be assured through strong defense that will act as a deterrent to anybody who might try to take over. That's one thing that we do use. We use realism in the U.S. We have a very strong home military, and it deters people from taking any kind of fight here to the U.S., and that's only been increased since things like 9/11. Foreign policy liberalists believe that national interests are secured by building alliances that make conflict more costly than cooperation. We want to have so many friends that we want to make it difficult if somebody has an argument with us to make any move, because then they're going to offend all of our friends. Foreign policy idealism emphasizes the promotion of American values of democracy, freedom, cultural diversity, and the belief that other nations that want to emulate our success in order to gain our support and our alliance. And then neoconservatism is a hybrid of everything else. It seeks the dual goals of enhancing military might and spreading support for democratic values and alliances around the globe. That's kind of the ideal thing that we want to shoot for. When we look at foreign policy options, leaders often use things like game theory and a lot of mathematical and statistical evaluations to figure this whole thing out. That's why we can give our input, but it takes a lot to be a specialist in foreign policy and to be able to see all the factors that get influenced by any single move. National security links diplomatic, economic, and military operations to a framework in which to achieve a nation's objectives, to get ourselves out there. The President and Congress share constitutional authority for conducting these kinds of policy. So when we talk about making foreign policy, the executive branch itself is in charge of the day-to-day operations of national security policy, but it relies on numerous agencies to provide guidance and information. The National Security Council is exactly what it sounds like. It's made up of the President, the Vice President, Secretaries of State, Defense, and Treasury, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, CIA Director, and the President's National Security Advisor. The Department of State is the chief diplomatic arm of the United States. They work as liaisons to other countries. The Department of Defense is exactly what it sounds like. It's responsible for maintaining the U.S. troops' combat readiness. And the Office of the Director of Intelligence oversees and coordinates intelligence gathering from our 16 intelligence agencies. Most people don't realize we have so many intelligence agencies. They can't even name them all off. They're like, oh, the NSA, the CIA, and then like, I don't know. We have a lot of people working to make sure that we stay safe from all the threats around us. Congress can also play a key role in foreign and defensive policy in a number of ways. The principal congressional foreign policy function is to provide funding. Remember, they're the big ones who hold the purse strings. They decide where all that money goes. Foreign policy in general is just limited by public opinion, in as much as policies have to attract popular support in order for them to succeed, in order for us to agree with them and implement them. There's a number of ways that nations can influence the actions of others. The biggest one is military power. Military power. It's really powerful. It's both an offensive and a defensive weapon to deter other countries from causing problems. Diplomacy is also really important. It's the peaceful use of incentives and deterrence to build alliances and support in order to avoid warfare. We want both of these to succeed at neoconservatism. Tools of foreign policy. The United States loans and grants in the form of military aids, economic assistance, humanitarian assistance, and assistance to multinational organizations in order to influence the policies of other nations and kind of garner some goodwill. That's why we always send people overseas to help out. We work with many international organizations in order to share information and resources. We like to influence world opinion and develop solutions to a lot of the world problems. When we look at confronting the future in foreign policy, after the fall of the Soviet Union, which is still relatively recent, the United States remained the only superpower in what was to become a unipolar power distribution in the world. And that's quickly changing, and we're going to have to adapt. Threats to the U.S. and world stability include things like terrorism, nuclear weapons, regional conflicts. The roots of terrorism include extremist ideologies, feelings of powerlessness, and a lot of the times terrorism is born of lack of economic opportunity in this globalized world. Because terrorism is a tactic, nations find it really difficult to defend against it. We can only do so much to prevent it. That's why it's still happening in the world. Despite various nuclear treaties in the world, there are still 8 nations that have nuclear weapons that are active, including some that are located in really volatile regions like North Korea. One of the biggest threats to us right now is the prospect of non-nation state actors gaining access to some of that nuclear material and using it against us or some of our allies. Now, when I say globalization, that's essentially the unifying of the world with goods, ideas, meaning, languages, and everything else. This is what ties us together as a nation and as a world, so that upheavals in one region tend to have impacts elsewhere. That's why we have to be comfortable about everything that we do. In the Middle East, a solution to the establishment of a permanent Palestinian state could probably ease a lot of tensions, but we don't see that happening anytime soon. The conflict over there has been going on for a very, very long time. Neither side has been able to negotiate and come to any kind of good, satisfactory conclusion. We also have issues in the Arab Spring. They've seen large groups of citizens in Arab countries challenging their rulers, and these kind of upheavals, again, cause some issues for us. So when we look at confronting the future with foreign policy, Africa has a lot of issues with economic expansion and modernization, and there's a persistence of a lot of internal conflict that's causing a lot of issues and a halt to progress. China's commercial growth has also enabled it to increase its military and economic muscles, which it has a lot of financial clout over us as the United States. It's actually an interesting concept. If they pulled in all of their financial credits that they have over us, we would be broken as a nation, which means that they have a lot of power over us. So looking at civic engagement and foreign policy today, Americans pay a lot more attention to our domestic policy because it directly affects us. We don't look a lot at foreign policy because we already kind of discussed with media that we don't have a lot of encounters with world news in general, so we're not always aware of foreign policy. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, send volunteers and money all over the world to help build civil societies, and sometimes they can be more helpful than our bureaucracy here. For the most part, governments don't play an active role in NGO governance and operations because they're pretty good at working themselves. They've been around for a long time and they've learned from the best bureaucratic structures. As a component of soft power, goodwill can be built for a nation by NGOs. So they can work in conjunction with each other. NGOs just have a lot more freedom than we do since they're not established with an actual government. I hope you guys have enjoyed this lecture. I'm going to have you do one more discussion really quick before you go off and do your own thing. I want you to ask yourselves and talk as a class, does the U.S. have the duty to intervene when genocide occurs in the world, whenever there's a negative issue that comes up? Should we intervene? Should we leave it alone? How much should we intervene and what should we do? How do we choose sides without offending the wrong people? I want you guys to talk about that for a little while. I will see you all next week. Remember, I have extended tutoring hours to help you out on Wednesday and Thursday. It'll be great to see you guys again. Until next time, bye.